And so with that bodhicitta in our hearts, then we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. Let's see. And so today we're not gonna look at the text because we finished the text, right? This is more like a discussion review class, something like that. And what I was thinking, so we have two of these, and so the way I was thinking is that today we'll mostly talk about the two lower, they call them tenet systems, right? The two tenet systems associated with the vehicles of individual liberation. And then next time we'll mainly focus on the two tenet systems of the Mahayana. And I was thinking, some people had already asked questions, like when we scheduled this and so on, a few people emailed. So I thought I'll like sort of talk for a little while, raise some thoughts, and then there'll also be time for a discussion, I'm hoping. Well, there's always time to pause and discuss, and then if people have questions or comments, we can also do that. I wasn't sure which order I'll do it, but I want to actually, I'll start with a particular point, which is probably the most, I mean, there are a lot of points about these, the two, the Vaibhashikas and the Sautantrikas, but from a practice perspective, right, like, probably nothing more important, particularly than selflessness, right? And remember, so I'm going to sort of talk about that a little bit, because people had asked questions. And so remember, so first of all, I want to remind everybody of a couple of things. So we're talking about the two lower tenet, right now I'm talking about the two lower school tenet systems, or sometimes they call them lesser vehicle tenet systems, right? Which are the Vaibhashikas and the Sautantrikas. And I want to remind everybody, first of all, those two tenet systems do not teach a selflessness of phenomena, right, or emptiness of phenomena. Right? They only teach selflessness of persons, right? And according to their tenets, it's the realization of the selflessness of persons is sufficient to achieve the goal, right, of liberation from samsara. As those who in this class know, that would be different from, say, the Majjhimaka school's view, but especially the Prasangika Majjhimakas, but that's not what we're talking about today, right? So according to these schools, realizing the selflessness of persons is sufficient to achieve, liberation. So then, according to these schools, and actually, this next point is true of all schools except the Majjhimakas, right? That they list they all agree on how they define in terms of selflessness of persons, the gross and the subtle selflessness of persons, right? And so I remind people, so right, like the gross selflessness of persons, according to all these different schools, is the lack of a permanent, unitary, independent self. Right? And then the subtle selflessness of persons is the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Those are the terms we use. But what I want to explore a little bit together is, what does that mean, right? Because I think that's that point, it applies to all these different schools. Actually, all Buddhists agree that those two things don't exist, right? That sentient beings are selfless in the sense that don't have those. So even the Majjhimakas even the Prasangikas would agree with that. They just say there's something subtler than those, right? Lack of an inherently existent self. But but they would agree that that beings are selfless in the sense of don't have such a self. And okay, so let's talk about those. And so we'll start with the gross one, right? We'll start with the gross one, which is right the lack of a permanent, unitary, independent self. And what I thought to talk a little bit about, just from because again, what we want to do first of all is you have to recognize if you have that, right? With each of these, you can't, what's the word? You can't realize selflessness unless you first can identify what is the self that you'd be grasping at, right? Then you can analyze, does that self exist? And so what does it mean to grasp at a permanent, unitary, independent self? And what I wanted to share actually from some Buddhist texts about this kind of self, and actually, well, a few points, one of which I already said before, but I'll say it again because it's relevant here, is that, this kind of self, the permanent, unitary, independent self, is always what's called an acquired. It's not, and the other type of self is innate, right? And so an acquired sense of self is one that was learned by thinking, right? That could mean various things, as I've said before. So one is, it could mean if you were raised in a certain tradition, right, you may have given rise to a certain kind of a sense of a permanent, unitary, independent self. If you, so it could be like from a religious tradition, right? Actually, I was thinking about just yesterday when I was sort of contemplating this, I was thinking of like when you watch, I was thinking about like how many movies there were growing up, and currently, right, where you see like somebody dies and then they meet with like all the people, right? They see their family and they all look like they did when the person was healthy and young, or that image in a movie, right, or a TV show or something, is getting at this point. Just recently I was watching a TV show, right, and this woman was having some kind of vision, right? It was like of her parents who had died and they were young and healthy and just like they were when at their height of their health or something, right, and well-being, as if there's some kind of permanent, singular being, right? I mean, even in, like who didn't change, some kind of essence like that. And so that's one point. Another point, just philosophically, is when it says permanent, unitary, and independent, those are three qualities of that self, right? But it could have any one of those. If it has even one of those three qualities, then that's permanent, then that's this gross self. But the important thing, I think, from a practical perspective that some people had asked about that I want to explore a little bit today, is that I'm going to contrast now the acquired sense of self and show, I want to kind of explore how that's different from the innate sense of self. And the main difference is this, is with this gross level of self that's acquired, actually, I'll call it this. In Buddhist philosophical terms, they say, what is the mode of apprehension? That was the term they use in some Buddhist texts. And what they say is it's something different from the body and mind, which exists. And so a way of saying it is it exists apart from the body and mind. It's unrelated to the body and mind. And it could be separated from the body and mind, right? So it's like a soul, right? And in this sense, this view, right, is that there's something that exists within you, right? That's like, and actually we say that, right? Sometimes we say, oh, that's going to, if you have a view, right, that at the time of when you die, if you're a good person, then you'll eternally be in heaven, right? And if you're a bad person, you'll eternally be in hell. That would be an example, right? That there's something that exists in you that's separate from your body and mind that will permanently be some other place, right? So there's this idea in this one that it's separable, and therefore it's not really related to the body and mind. Does that make sense? So it's like a different kind. So it's like some kind of essence. You could say essence or soul or Atman. The original term would have been Atman in Buddhism. That's separable from the body and mind. And so in this sense, and it could have any of these three qualities, right? So permanent means never changing or eternal, right? Unitary means singular, and it's not dependent upon the parts of your body, right? It's not your amygdala or your, ventricles or your whatever, right? It's not, it's unrelated to the parts. And it's independent in the sense that it doesn't depend upon momentary causes and conditions. But I think a key difference here from the innate one that we're going to explore in a minute is that this one is exists apart from your body and mind. And the point here I just want to get to is that's not innate, right? In other words, and one way of saying it is, animals don't have a sense of a self or a soul that's separable from their body and mind, right? And so human beings don't innately have that either. That's a sort of, and it could have, and one point that I mentioned before, which is true in Buddhism, is that this could be learned in this life, or also we could have this, what's it called, acquired sense of self from a past life. If you've been habituated for many lifetimes with a certain kind of view that you can come in grasping at it. And so there also, so in Buddhism they sometimes say, so be careful what you grasp at, be careful what you start to believe in, because it creates a karmic habit of believing in that, or a habit that can go from life to life. But so it's separate from and separable from the aggregates, and it doesn't depend upon them. Now I want to talk about the subtle, right? So contrast that. So I want to pause there for a second, just so reflect for a moment. Like, actually, it's either for yourself. Have there been times where or have there been times when you've had such a sense of a soul, right? And I'll make a point. It's very easy to. I mean, this is easy for me personally. I could easily think. Man, I don't think I ever personally had that one because I didn't grow up conditioned with that or something. But I can think of many people who have that, who I know, like people I like, who would say, yes, like there is, I have an eternal soul, and it's not, and that, that they believe that they'll go, if they have a certain kind of faith, or if they do a certain kind of thing, they'll go to heaven and so on, right? It's very common. This is not something esoteric, right? It's quite common that people would believe in such a soul. Many people do and many people don't, but this is not an uncommon thing, so it's easy to kind of think about, right? And sometimes it's like, and I want to point out one more point. For some people, if you think about whether it be yourself now or in the past or somebody else, right? There are some people for whom like their idea of this is very much in line with a certain religion's doctrine of that. But then there are many other people who just have an intuitive sense of that, right? Or have some intuitive idea. And even like, to think of people like who are not following any specific religion, but are a little bit like, have some kind of new age idea that's similar to this, but have some idea that there's something that's unrelated to the body and mind, that's eternal, and that's permanent. So the reason why I'm just saying it that way is, there are many, whether your tendency is kind of, whether like in other words, that's why I'm saying it could be any one of those, permanent, unitary, or independent. So a person could be Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or could be some kind of amalgamation, or it could be like following some kind of idea of their own. But if they have this kind of idea, right, then that's grasping at what Buddhism would call the gross sense of self, right? These schools of Buddhism would call a gross sense of self. Now, I want to contrast that because I think it'll help clarify with the subtle selflessness, right? Which is the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And I hopefully this will help you have a sense of the difference between the two, because I think sometimes people are a little confused. What's the difference? So the difference with this one, I'm going to go back to the same term, the mode of apprehension. So, and by the way, with the self-sufficient, substantially existent, there is a version that's acquired, but that's not what I'm going to talk, which would still be, it could be self-sufficient, substantially existent, but it would still be this kind of eternal, separable thing. That's not, so now what I want to talk about is the innate one, the innate version. And the difference there is that there is no mode of apprehension of something apart from the body and mind. Instead, it's intimate. So there's an idea of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self that's, but that's, what's the word? By its nature, connected to the body and mind. And one way of talking about that is that, and actually, this one is very common also, but I want to contrast it, right? It's not some idea of eternal soul that's going to go somewhere else at the time of death or something like that. This one actually is very innate. It's innate and it's common. I'm going to use examples in language, which is His Holiness Dalai Lama often uses and other teachers use, which is, and it's like this. It's like when you say, when a person, I mean, we all can do this at times, right? Where you say, the Dalai Lama often uses this example. Like he says, you know, if a person is, you know, if you see somebody who's, say, younger and either more fit or more healthy or more beautiful or more whatever than oneself, one could say, oh, I wish I had that. I wish I had a body like that, right? I wish I had my, or you could say of yourself, oh, I wish I had my younger body. I wish I was still this age, right? So it feels, the point is it feels like there's a self that's somehow the owner or the controller of the body and mind, and I'd like to trade one in, you know. And the same thing can happen with the mind, right? If you say, oh, I wish I was smart like this person, or I wish I was had a good memory like so-and-so, or I wish I, whatever, you know, like, so it could be with the body and it could be with the mind. But the feeling here is that there's a self somehow in the body and mind, right? And so, or something, and actually it's interesting, you know, there are some texts that say, like, sometimes it feels like it's in the body and mind, sometimes it feels like it owns the body and mind or controls the body and mind. Sometimes it feels like the body and mind are within it. But it's this sense of a self that's innately there, and that yeah, that's, you can say is that's the controller. That's the term they used. So it's not unrelated. It's not separable. There's not some idea that you can separate it from the body and mind and go somewhere else and it's eternal. But it's this feeling that feeling and belief and grasping at a kind of yeah, that one possesses the body and mind, or owns the body and mind, or controls the body and mind. These are different terms I'm using to capture the feeling, right? It's interesting, right? Like if you're sick, actually, and you feel, oh, I wish I were healthy, right? Which we all do, right? That's innate. That's an example, right? So it implies, right? It implies there's a belief in a self that somehow, like if your body has a sickness in that moment, right? It implies there's a self, right? That's control, that somehow could, that's not like, that you could have a different body, right? Or that you could somehow trade in the sick body for a healthy body. So it implies there's some kind of self there, right? That that's in the body, right? Lynn, go ahead.
It's like the expression which I use, admittedly, is when something extraordinary happens that's not usual, you say it was an out-of-body experience, because it's not, it's extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, and you get it, like what we're doing here is we're looking at like our own experience and our use of language to go, wait a second, like what does that even mean? Exactly, yeah, you start to look at, you know, not just, it's language, but language is trying to capture a feeling. And what you start to realize is, oh, wow, I'm using language to relate to a feeling, and that feeling is coming from this kind of self-grasping oftentimes, right? I had an out-of-body experience. What's that I, right? That somehow could have that, right? Yeah, you get it. And there are hundreds or thousands of different, you know, if you start to check on yourself, that's the idea here. If you start to watch yourself, the other one, right, the permanent unitary independent one, that's easier, right? This one's harder, because there are hundreds of versions, right? Like, even like, you know, if I say, oh, I've, like actually just the other day I was feeling this way. I was feeling, I mean, just much more mundane, but I was tired and I was annoyed. I was like, oh, I don't want to be tired. Why am I tired? This is annoying. I want to be energized, you know, I want to be energetic. And so it's like, well, I used to stop and go, who's that I, right? That wants to trade in tired aggregates for untired aggregates. I'm just picking an example, right? And this is like every day over and over again, we have these kinds of, right? Or like if somebody said, oh, I'm feeling kind of down today. I don't, I don't, like, I wish I could feel happy, right? It's normal, right? But again, like, who is that I, right? That wants to, change that, that wants to trade in the unhappy mind for a happy mind. And we intuitively, and you see my point here, you see the difference, right? This is an intuitive sense of I. And what they're saying is this is innate, right? Meaning, one way of meaning that is that's babies have this, and dogs have it too, right? Like, so a dog would have this sense of I, a cat would have this sense of I. In other words, it's this is the one, according to these tenet systems, that's the root of samsara, right? And so I just want to pause, like, just to reflect, because this is the point, so just pause and reflect for a moment on the difference between those two. And can you identify that one, right? Like, can you feel like there was the first one, right? The soul or Atman, or again, I personally think once you understand what that one is, right? So that it's either permanent or it's unitary or it's independent or in two or three of those, right? That's where, I mean, you get that one. That's different. You feel the difference. That one is like, if you have some feeling like, oh, when I die, everybody I loved will be there looking healthy and young, like they did when I, whatever, like, but it'll be like my mom will look like she did in 19 whatever, and my father will look like he did in this other year, and my grandfather will look like he did in that year, right? Some kind of idea that there's going to be, it's not a fantasy of everybody will look how I wanted them to look at the time I liked best, and and they'll all greet me and take me to heaven, and I'll be there forever, right? That's an example of it, right? Like, that one is pretty easy to see, like that, as if there's some kind of permanent person that didn't change. If I had that fantasy, well, my grandfather didn't look like that when he was 86 anyway, so it's ridiculous, right? Whereas this one is more subtle. I'm getting at? This one is like, so try to, and actually, I just want to emphasize. So one is, you would start to notice, how do I grasp at that one, right? Like Lynn's example, right? But you would start to see there are many, many, many examples of how we grasp at this one, right? And I'll go back. So here, self-sufficient, right, means, it's simple. It means it could stand on its own. It's not dependent upon the body and mind. And it's not dependent upon them because it would want to trade them in, for example, right? It feels like it owns them, right? It's connected to them, but it doesn't feel like it's dependent upon them. That's wrong view, right? Yeah, and as if it, so it's not separate from the body and mind, but it's also, it feels like it's not separate from them, but it's also not dependent upon them. And that's a wrong understanding. It's a grasping at something that doesn't exist in that sense. I want to give one more example, actually, right? Like, just to contemplate, right? Like, because again, I'm trying to get at how innate this one is and why it's innate, right? Or what it's like. Like, so actually think about something that makes you anxious, right? Like, maybe it could be like public speaking, right? Or meeting a whole group of new people, or having to, whatever, having to perform in some way in front of strangers, whatever. It could be any of various things, or meeting some certain kind of person or something. Right. And there's a feeling like, oh, will they accept me or like me? Right? And that's a very, it's actually a feeling, right? You could usually feel it in your chest, sometimes your throat, right? Something like that. And ask yourself, what's that I? Right? That's not that one. I'm giving an example. That's not the permanent unitary independent I, right? That's the self-sufficient substantially existent I, right? So if you're feeling like, oh, I'm going to meet somebody famous, or I'm going to meet somebody powerful, or I'm going to have to present in front of a group of strangers, and right, and there's this feeling that comes up, right? Will I be accepted, or will I do good and well enough, or something, right? And then you ask, what is that I? Right? And it's actually interesting, isn't it? If you start to actually analyze that one, right? At one moment, it might think, well, will I look good? Another moment, it might feel, will what I say be good? Will I be impressive? So it could be about your body, it could be about your speech, or it could be about your mind, right? Will what my mind shows it thinks about this be acceptable, or will I seem stupid or something, right? Again, that's this self-sufficient, substantially existent. Oh, I don't want to look stupid, or something like that, right? That's this self-sufficient, substantially existent I. And that, according to these two tenet systems, is the subtle, right? Self. That's the cause of all samsara. And a couple more quick points. So one is, we have to, if you want to achieve liberation according to these tenet systems, first, if you have a grasping at a gross self, right, a permanent, unitary, independent one, you have to overcome that first, right? Because that's grosser. It's easier to overcome. Right, and so you can recognize it's easy. In many ways, that one's much easier, right? Like, of course, there's no I that's permanent, right? And so on. That's easy. You can analyze that and contemplate. The second one is more subtle, right? And you have to contemplate: is there a self that exists independent of the aggregates? Right? Is there a self that exists within the aggregates? Right? That's findable, and so on. And you would do an analysis like that in order to overcome this this sense of grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. And that, that's the selflessness that one then meditates on according to these tenet systems in order to achieve moksha, right? Liberation, freedom from suffering. Okay, so maybe I'll pause there and see if people have questions. I wanted to sort of, this is a very important point about the selflessness of persons. It's the core path to liberation according to these tenet systems. So if people weren't clear about those two, then it's hard to understand, that's from a practice perspective, that's the core thing. Later we'll get to in maybe next class, we can talk about what's the difference between the self-sufficient, substantially existent self and what the Madhyamakas posit is, the Prasangika Madhyamakas posit as a subtle self. But first, it's important to just get clear what's the self-sufficient, substantially existent one, right? Because if you can't get that one, you're not going to get the other anyway. But any questions or comments about these two kinds of selflessness of persons according to these those two lower tenet systems? Oh, Varahi, yeah.
Lorna, are they saying that the substantially existent person is controlling the body and mind, but and is linked to it, but it's not actually the body and mind, if that indeed existed?
Yeah. So and one point is like if you actually look at this self-grasping, like, I think you're asking a good question about this, and yeah, first of all, in general, they're not saying it's the body or the mind. They say because it's related to the body and mind, but it's not dependent on the body and mind. But also, one point I'll make is, like, I think if you actually look at this one, right, what you'll see is sometimes it feels like it's the controller of the body and mind, right? So that means it's not one or the other. But at other times, you can sort of see where, like, it's more identified with one than the other. So sometimes you can see, if you actually watch this, and you'll see it changes, right? Like, sometimes it feels like, oh, I wish I had my 25-year-old body, right? So then it feels like it's something separate. Then another moment you might feel, oh, you hit me, right? Somebody hits you, oh, you hit me, right? As if you are the body. And then, another moment you might feel, oh, I'm feeling really happy, as if you're the mind, right? So this one, actually, it's always grasping at a self, but actually, if you watch its mode of apprehension, it kind of does this, it's tricky in a way, right? Sometimes it feels like it's sort of there as an owner of the body and mind. Sometimes it's identified with one or the other. So I think it's like that.
Thank you. I sometimes I think of it like, and this may be wrong, so please correct me, I think of it like a grocery bag. Like, sometimes it's the bag, the self is the bag containing the groceries, the body and mind. And other times I think it's in the bag.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to think about it. John? Yeah.
I may have missed this, but you've been talking about the two schools focusing on the self or the lack of self. But it doesn't, you said it didn't talk, what you said in the very beginning, it doesn't focus on what I call the rest of samsara. Is it just left blank that they don't think about it? Or do they think other things? I mean, is it a nihilism approach that nothing else really exists at all, so we don't even talk about it? How do they recognize everything else that exists in our space?
Actually, so these schools don't teach a selflessness of phenomena. So from their perspective, what they would say, actually, I mean, each of them is different, but I'll use the Vaibhashikas as the example. They would say, for them, like, I'll use this Vaibhashikas example. They would say, like, so for example, matter, right? All the matter in the universe. They would say that the atoms that make up matter are existent. They exist and they're real. You can go into more detail, but and then they would say, gross things that are sort of composed of those atoms are conventional truths, but if you can break them down to the sort of fundamental stuff of them, but that fundamental stuff is truly existent and is real. And so in that sense, I guess what I would say is, like, they would say a couple of things. One is that both of these schools actually would say that external objects are truly existent and inherently existent, and that and what they would say actually is, like, and that analyzing them beyond that doesn't, is like, from their perspective, it's self-grasping that causes suffering. So they would just say the rest of the universe, the rest of matter, let's say, exists, and it exists, it's truly existent. And they would say, and it doesn't, what's this, right? That it's what really matters is how you grasp it yourself, because that's what gives rise to your mental afflictions. And so you have to realize selflessness in order to stop giving rise to mental afflictions and therefore stop suffering. But, like, so if you were to say to them, but does, like, do atoms of gold exist or whatever, they would say, yeah, those exist. And and they would say, and they would leave it at that. They would just say those things exist, they're truly existent, and that they're not the cause of suffering. It's your self-grasping that's the cause of suffering. Does that answer your question then?
I think so, but I'm going to ask, I guess, two more follow-on questions based on what you said. So they would say the grasping for the best iPad or the best new iPhone, it's not the issue of that iPad exists or doesn't exist. It's our grasping of it that creates a problem for ourselves.
Yep.
Okay. What would they think of other living beings, like, your cat or a chimpanzee or a dolphin? Would they put them in the same category as the iPad?
They would say, like, those beings also have self grasping and therefore are within samsara. That they also grasp at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, and because of that, they created karma and therefore are currently reborn in an animal realm, and are therefore, and are worthy of compassion. Because they're suffering.
They would put them more in the same category as humans than as the iPad.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other comments or questions about this, Sujata?
I happen to be very lucky right now, as you're talking, to have had a flu shot yesterday that I'm having a really strong reaction to. And so last night, I was really, really miserable, right? And my mind was miserable, my body was miserable, and I was trying to get my mind and my body to stop being so miserable. And it's at one point it was ibuprofen, another point it was, taking a shower, and then I was trying, Thonglen, and I was trying it. Everything was to make me less miserable, right? Because I was miserable. And it was really interesting as you were speaking just now, earlier, if I just drop the I, and like I was just having this like prickly hot misery in my body, and if I just dropped the I and was like, there's heat, there's prickling, the suffering went away, right? It was just observation of heat and prickling. I have a lot more trouble doing that with my thoughts, right? Like I can remember to do that with my body when my body's miserable. And then, you just watch, drop the I, and then there's just stuff to observe. It's not so miserable anymore. So that's just an observation that, like, there's this real distinction between the ability to objectify the body and the ability to objectify the thoughts that are causing the misery. Whatever. So that's just the one thing. And then I just want to name that out loud. And then the other thing is I'm still really struggling with what is the substantially existent thing? Like those words, really, I get stuck on those words. So, and how that really, I think that I get too caught in these words: permanent, unitary, independent versus self-sufficient, substantially existent. The permanent I can see as being something different between the two, but the self-sufficient, substantially existent, it's particularly substantially existent. I don't really understand what those words are trying to get at. The self-sufficient I don't know, that feels easier to get my brain around, but I'm trying to see what are they getting at with a substantially, like, is it really there? Is it like really, like, do they mean like it's, I don't know, that word, the substantially existent thing feels hard to get my brain around. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what is substantially existent about.
I'll say a couple quick thoughts on that. Like one is, so I'll go through the two terms actually. So about this one. So self-sufficient would mean that it's not dependent upon the aggregates, really. That's that one. So in other words, so that's really that. So self-sufficient means it's, because in reality, if there is, when we merely label the self, or when we label a self, it's dependent upon the aggregates. Here it doesn't. If the self-sufficient means it's not dependent upon the aggregates. So it does, and so that's where, if it can be an owner of the aggregates, it doesn't exist in dependence upon them, right? It's as if it's something self-sufficient in the sense of not dependent upon those. Substantially existent. Actually, I want to hold on one second. Let me grab the Vaibhashika section of the text here. One way of thinking about I'm going to answer that question from the perspective for a moment, if I can find the right. Yeah, so I'll say it this way. Like, so one way of saying it from a Vaibhashika perspective is that something substantially existent, according to them, I'm sure I'm saying it right. Yeah, whatever is an ultimate truth, according to them. And remember, according to them, this is what I was pulling up here, an ultimate truth, I was pulling up our text. So an ultimate truth is a phenomena such that an awareness apprehending it is not canceled if it is broken up or mentally separated into individual parts. And so because according to them, right, according to the Vaibhashikas, examples of a substantially existent ultimate truth, right, would be a directionally partless particle, or a temporally partless moment, or uncompounded space. Those are examples of ultimate truths according to them, right? So that they're in some sense substantially existent is like ultimately existent, ultimately true, unbreak, and that the consciousness apprehending them, wouldn't be canceled if it were broken into parts, or if it fell apart. So that's one way of thinking about what is substantially existent according to this school. You could say it's like saying it's an ultimate, because according to this school, those things, right, directionally partless particles, temporally partless moments, and unconfounded space are substantially existent according to them. But grasping at a I that exists in that way, in some ultimate sense, or in some unbreakdownable sense, that would be substantially existent.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, okay. Maybe any other questions about that before I'll go? I'll keep talking about this school, but maybe I'll say, well, maybe I'll do that. I'll go on to a couple more points now. Again, these are things people had asked about, so I'll make sure I just mention them. So people had asked, like, and I kind of want to say something more general now about this as I go into this next point, which is that, okay, right, like this. So these two schools, right? First of all, they still exist is one point, right? And then there's something kind of tricky though, in a way, because some people have asked me, like, oh, where are these practiced, or by whom are these practiced, and a number of people have asked those kinds of questions. I was sort of contemplating that, and I was like, I want to give a technical answer, but it's actually much more complicated than that. Okay? Because one point, I guess what I'll say is this: is, if you think about any given individual person, right? It's actually an interesting thing to contemplate. Like, actually, I want to preface this for a second, which is sort of making me smile to think of this. There's a famous story of Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa, after he had been like a great yogi, he meditated on emptiness, and then he did retreat, and he was able to see Manjushri in person, right? He had visions that would talk to Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom, right? And there's this famous moment that's been told where he kind of, I'm not going to get the wording exactly right, but basically, like, he had these meditative experiences, and he went to Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom, and he said, my view and meditation on emptiness at this stage of his life, right? He said, is it in accordance with the Sautantrika Madhyamaka or the Prasangika Madhyamaka? Like, what kind of view do I have? And Manjushri said, it's not any, your experiences are not any of those. It's not actually correct, even, or something yet. So Tsongkhapa was sort of thinking he was a Madhyamaka at that phase, and Manjushri says to him, no, what you were realizing isn't really even maybe Buddhist. I'm not sure. It was like, that wasn't any of the above yet. Tsongkhapa later realized the Prasangika view. But the point being, the reason why I tell that story is, like, so we can, my point is, we can be a follower of a certain tenet system in our words, but that doesn't mean we're actually yet a follower of that tenet system. Does that make sense? Like, and we could be a follower of the Mahayana, but not have bodhicitta, so we're not really Mahayana. So you could say, oh, I'm a Mahayana Buddhist, but if you're not practicing bodhicitta, then you're a Mahayana Buddhist linguistically, but not in practice yet, right? And the same thing, you could be and part of the point is, like, sometimes I'm watching, I'm saying that partly because it's true, and partly sometimes I'm like watching, for example, if you see it online, I often join those online teachings by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and sometimes you can see where, like, so there are monks in a Theravadan tradition who are taking the Bodhisattva vow from the Dalai Lama, right? And so are they, they're taking the Bodhisattva vow, so are they practicing the vehicle of individual liberation, or are they practicing Mahayana? They're monks in a Theravadan tradition, but as an individual, maybe they're Mahayanas. Does that make sense? Like, so you could be saying, oh, I'm a Mahayana Buddhist, but you could be practicing selfishness, right? And you could be a monk or a nun in the Theravadan tradition, and you could be practicing the Bodhisattva path. So at one point I'm just making, I guess, is what any individual person practices and is only they know, or only, through discussion, maybe they can tell you and then you can know, but you can't judge somebody based on what their clothes are, or what country they're from, or if they have a certain label sort of superficially. that doesn't really answer this question, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to say that first, because it can be, there are many stories, like Lama Zopa tells stories of their, he told the story, he knew an abbot, a Tibetan Buddhist monk who was an abbot, and he said, but he hadn't yet taken refuge, really. He wasn't practicing refuge. He wasn't really Buddhist in the sense that he wasn't fulfilling the requirement. I mean, he took the words of refuge, but he was saying, he hadn't yet practiced refuge in his heart, and I think he knew this person, so there was the person, obviously the words of refuge if he was an abbot, but of a monastery. But so my point is like, we can talk in some general terms, but when it comes to actual practice, it's what's in that individual person's heart and mind. And it's also what's in their heart and mind at that moment, if that makes sense, right? Because you can see examples where people, and that's why I gave the example of Tsongkhapa, right? He changed over time, and everybody changes over time, and so just because you practice something or at one phase of your life doesn't mean it's always true either. So I wanted to preface this with that. But then, that said, now in terms of lineage, right? I said early on when we were studying the Vaibhashikas, I said there were historically 18 sub-schools of the Vaibhashikas at one, in the early times in India. And one point is, so all of the Vinaya lineages, Vinaya are the vows, right? The vows of, actually there are many different vows of lay women and vows of lay men and vows of novice nuns and novice monks and fully ordained nuns and fully ordained monks and so on. There are all kinds of Vinaya. Vinaya means taking vows, right? The teachings on the vows, and there are lineages of those. So one point is, all of the Vinaya lineages that exist, that have ever existed in Buddhism, are connected to those 18 Vaibhashika sub-schools. So they still exist. 3 of them still exist now. So of the 18, I guess 15 don't exist anymore as Vinaya lineages anyway, but 3 do. And so one point is, so when we say, oftentimes we'll say Theravadan monks or Theravadan nuns, right? And actually Theravada is a Pali word, which in Sanskrit was, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly in Sanskrit, but Stavira. Yes, Stavira. I'm not sure how my pronunciation is in Sanskrit, but anyway, Stavira or Theravadan was one of the 18 Vaibhashika sub-schools, right? So that was a Vinaya lineage, but it was also a philosophical lineage, right, of Vaibhashikas. And I'm mentioning them because, so the Theravadan tradition, right, of monastic vows spread from India south and went to, Thailand and Burma and Cambodia and a number of other countries in the south. And that lineage still exists. So technically, if you were to say Theravadins, right, from a historical perspective, they would be connected back to what Tibetans, what we would call Vaibhashika. But then, again, I'm trying to emphasize here, so that in terms of lineage, that's one of the 18 Vaibhashika lineages. But again, it's never that, from an individual perspective, it's never that simple. Because remember, I just want to point out historically, right? Atisha, right, who was one of the great proponents of Mahayana Buddhism, who brought, the Lojong mind training teachings to Tibet. Where did he go to study Lojong? He went to Indonesia. Right? Indonesia was, so his teacher in Indonesia, I assume, I'm not sure actually what his Vinaya lineage was, but his teacher, I think, was probably a Theravadan in the Vinaya, but was a Bodhisattva, had realized bodhicitta, and held the Lojong teachings and taught them to Atisha, who then brought them to Tibet, and everybody in Tibet practices Lojong. So my point is that you have to check for the individual is one point. But in terms of the Theravadan tradition as a tradition, it's connected. It would be part of the Vaibhashikas. So does every follower of the Theravadan actually follow Vaibhashika tenets? No. But certainly some do, and it's there in the teachings, if that makes sense. And that's part of that lineage. Just for what it's worth, I'll mention those. So what we call sometimes the Pali, the traditions that follow the Pali canon, or the Theravadins, or sometimes Mahayanas will call them Hinayana practitioners, whatever. Like, that's mostly the Theravadins. That's who still exists, right, as a Vinaya lineage, and they exist mainly in South Asia. Or that's where now they've spread. Of course, there are lots of Theravada monks and nuns in the U.S., for example, so in Europe. But I mean, that's where they held out those lineages, is mostly South Asia. Then Southeast Asia. But I guess then I want to just emphasize the two other Vaibhashika lineages that still exist. One exists in the Tibetan tradition. In other words, it's kind of, and so it's called the Mullah Sarvastavatan Vinaya lineage. That's one of the 18 subschools of the Vaibhashikas. And all Tibetan, anybody who's a monk or a nun in the Tibetan tradition took, that's the lineage of the vows they've taken. So part of this Vaibhashika tradition is held in Central Asia, right? In Tibet, Mongolia, Bhutan, and it's this Mullah Sarvastavatan lineage, and so that's also a Vaibhashika lineage. The third one that still exists, and again, I'm just for information, it's good to know, is the Dharmagupta, and that's the Vinaya lineage that exists in East Asia, so like China, Taiwan, places like that. One sort of point of interest, I think, is that it's kind of sad to me, but it's sadly true, that the Dharmaguptas of East Asia are also from would also be one of the 18 subschools of Vaibhashikas, and they're the only Buddhist tradition that still has a valid lineage. For the Vinaya, the vows have to go back to the Buddha, is the idea, right? And been passed, because only monks or nuns can ordain other monks and nuns. So it has to be, the Buddha was the original monk, and then it had to get passed down. And the other two existing lineages lost their lineage of bhikshunis, of fully ordained nuns. So the only tradition that still has a lineage of bhikshunis is the Dharmagupta lineage. And that's why when nuns, some friends, like nuns who are in the Tibetan tradition, wanted to take full ordination, they went to East Asia, like Tupten Chodron's an example, who went, she went to East Asia and took it, I think in Taiwan, took the vows of bhikshuni, and then she and some other nuns are doing wonderful work trying to allow that lineage to now exist in other countries. And so she's created Shravasti Abbey in the U.S. In order to allow that tradition to exist in the U.S. And she's been working with His Holiness Dalai Lama and some other nuns to help eventually give Himalayan nuns the opportunity to become bhikshunis if they want to. But the challenge is that they would have to mix the Dharmagupta and the Mullah Sarvastavatan lineages together in order to allow that, because the Tibetan Mullah Sarvastavadans lost that, so they have to bring it in from the Dharmaguptas. So there's an idea to eventually allow that or bring that into the tradition for the Himalayan nuns. So anyway, those traditions do still exist, is my point. And then also, what I want to say though is then in terms of actual people, what I would suggest is you have to really listen. Like in other words, is any given person practicing the Sautantrika or the Vaibhashika or the Madhyamaka or whatever? So one point I would make is, like, really what we have to do is actually pay attention to our, to what we're practicing or what the other person's teaching. And if you listen carefully, and one point I'll make is this is just, once you've studied tenets, we're all, I think, in the US. So if you listen here in the US, what you'll find, I believe, is sometimes what people say, if you listen really carefully, doesn't accord with any Buddhist tenet system. So that somebody will be teaching Buddhism, but if you listen really carefully, you would have to say, that traditional Buddhist teachers would say that's not Buddhism. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go tell the person if they're not Buddhist, if they say they're Buddhist. That's not my point. But my point is like, if you're actually contemplating these points. And then there are other people, I think, where if you listen, you can go, oh, wow, is that, if you really listen carefully to their words and what they're teaching or what they're writing, you could say, is that in accordance with the Vaibhashikas? Is that in accordance with the Satantrikas? Is that in accordance with the mind-only school or the Madhyamaka? Maybe I'll read something here. I was actually, just because we were talking about this, see if I can find it. Oops. I was sort of looking back and so I was actually looking at, I'll read again. I just want to read you, like, so since we're talking about the lineages that like that come from Vaibhashika and Satantrika, I actually got out a number of books last night. I was looking through them, and I'll just read you some quotes. This is Insight Meditation by Joseph Goldstein. I'm just going to read a quote. Understanding no self does not come from destroying something we call self or ego. The Great Awakening or discovery of the Buddha revealed that there was no self, no permanent I to begin with. So if there is nothing we have to get rid of, then understanding selflessness very simply comes from careful awareness of what is actually happening moment to moment. And I'll read another, I'll jump down a little bit. We might, when we think, we might believe the knowing I is the self, because knowing or consciousness is much more subtle than other arising objects. You might find it difficult at first to be mindful of it, but the mind's power of steadiness, stillness, and clarity goes stronger. We can become aware of awareness. And he's saying an awareness is not a permanent I. So what tenet system is that? I'm not, I'm just giving an example, right? Like if that's, he's describing selflessness. I'll read you another quote. This one's from Jack Kornfield from Path with Heart. And again, I just looked through and found their teachings on selflessness. I wasn't trying to, but here's what he says. The Buddha described human life as comprising a series of ever-changing processes. A physical process, a feeling process, a memory and recognition process, a thought and reaction process, a consciousness process. Right, the 5 aggregates he's describing there. These processes are dynamic and continuous without a single element we can call our unchanging self. We ourselves are a process woven together with life without separateness. We arise like a wave out of the ocean of life. Our tentative form is still one with the ocean. Some traditions call this ocean the Tao, the divine, the fertile void, the unborn. Out of it, our lives appear as reflections of the divine, a moment or a dance of consciousness. The most profound sense of this process is life-giving emptiness. And again, I'm just asking you what, I'm not going to, I don't know, what tenet system does that, and again, what tenet systems do those words reflect? I'll read one last one. Actually, I'll read you one more. If we are not caught up in all our thoughts about our experience, there is simply the experience in each moment, just seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. All of this is emptiness without a self. Lynn, yeah.
I can't find my outline, so I don't know the name, but you described, I think it was maybe the mind-only school, where there was sort of the holding pen for consciousness. It was like,
Alaya Vijnana.
yeah, exactly. That's what it sounds like. It's like there's a consciousness and everything goes in it. Maybe not. I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, then again, I don't have an assertion of what sentence they're following. I just wanted to read the quotes to give examples of, like, you know, different, you know, what I mean. I'm not trying to criticize them either. And also, first of all, like, I'm not sure what tenet systems they follow. I'm not sure that they would, you know, like I never ask them or something like that. But it's worth asking. It's worth contemplating. You know, is that in accordance with mind only, or is that in accordance with one of these others? I'm not sure, you know, and I'm not 100% sure. We could go back and analyze the words and sort of make an argument, but it's interesting to think about as we listen, you know, because you may listen to a lot of people talk about Buddhism, and then they kind of go, what tenets, you know, what is that Buddhism? And if it is, what tenet system is that in accordance with? Ryan? Yeah.
Jack Kornfield's writing there, he said something about, you know, moment to moment, basically experiencing your senses moment to moment. But did any of the tenet systems kind of focus on like a sense consciousness being like the way he makes it sound, it sounds like, well, you know, your senses are there even if you're not there, but don't all the tenet systems kind of focus on sense consciousness as being comprising consciousness in general? So if you're focusing on them as being like inherently existent moment to moment, it didn't sound like any of the systems to me, unless I'm forgetting something.
One point I'll make is like say it this way, like, you know, either of the two Mahayana tenet systems, right? So actually, if you think of Jack Kornfield's quote, where he says, I'll pull it back up here. I'll take it back out. So he's talking about the five aggregates, right? And then he says these processes are dynamic and continuous. So he's talking about impermanence there, right? Mm-hmm. Without a single element, we call an unchanging self. So he's refuting an unchanging self here, right? Then he says, we ourselves are a process woven together of life without separateness. I'm not sure what he means when he says we arise like a wave out of the ocean of life. Our intentative forms still one with the ocean. I'm not sure what he means, but so I'm not sure what he's getting at. But in terms of what you were raising, Ryan, I guess point I'll make is either of the Mahayana tenet systems would assert that this is right. You know, talk about emptiness as a non-affirming negation, right? So for them, if you're still grasping at sense consciousnesses in the moment, that's not right. The view. Now, to contrast that for a second, I'm going to use an example of the Sautantrikas, though. The Sautantrikas say that there's no independent, you know, unitary, independent, unitary, permanent self, and there's also no self-sufficient substantial existence of. They do say, though, that, and I've got our text out. They say ultimate truths are phenomena that are able to perform a function. An ultimate truth is a truly established thing, an impermanent phenomena, a compound. So a Sautantrika would say that, you know, so for example, that in the moment, like a sound or a touch in that moment is an ultimate truth in the sense that it's a phenomenon that's able to perform a function. It's without a personal self of persons, but it is truly existent and it is inherently existent according to them. You know, so that's where you have to, I mean, that's why I can't really say what, I mean, I wouldn't presume to imagine I know what Jack Kornfield's tenet system is. But if you look at this particular sentence in this book, which was written many years ago, you could say, well, like, it's interesting. One sentence could be in accordance with the Sautantrika school. Another sentence really doesn't fit the Sautantrika school, you know, and that's where it's quite kind of tricky, right? Because like this sentence, these processes are dynamic and continuous without a single element we can call our unchanging self. Now, I would say a Sautantrika could agree with that sentence, right? Because there are things, according to them, that are dynamic and continuous, and there's no unchanging self. They would say that there are a series of ever-changing processes, physical processes, feelings, memories, thoughts, consciousness, and that those are ever-changing. So a Sautantrika would agree with that sentence. But then he said, well, let's see, where he says, we are woven together with life without separateness. I'm not sure what I don't think a Sautantrika would say, I don't know probably a Sautantrika strictly would say, I don't know what that is. Like
a little hippy dippy, little new agey, right?
That's a little.
It actually feels really Hindu to me.
Oh, does it? Okay, I don't know that.
Especially the waves.
That's
a very specific Advaita philosophy about the nature of the self.
Okay. Well, then he says some traditions call this the Tao, which of course is Taoism, the divine reflect. Did you say here the Tao, the divine, which no Buddhist would use that term, the fertile void. Buddhists wouldn't call that the void, actually. So, so there he's kind of gone off into various traditions that are not, but maybe by when he says the divine, maybe he's referring to Hinduism there. I'm not sure. But so I guess my point is some of his sentence, there are two sentences maybe where you could say that would fit with the Sautantrika school. There are other sentences where it really wouldn't fit with the tenet system. And that's part of the challenge, I guess. The reason why that's part of the reason why I picked those books is, and even actually I'll share one more. Just last night at the same time, I didn't bring it into the room today, but the other book I picked up was Thoughts Without a Thinker by Mark Epstein, which is a book I enjoyed very much years ago because it was about therapy. He was a psychiatrist, and so it was about therapy from a Buddhist perspective. And I was looking at that book and I was like, the title, right, Thoughts Without a Thinker, implies that thoughts have a different status, like existence status, than the thinker, right? So the person, which is not in accordance with the Prasangika view, right? Prasangikas would say thoughts and the thinker both equally are not true. But then in the book itself, I hadn't looked at the book in many years, and I was looking in there, and in the book he quotes Nagarjuna at certain points. So I was like, and my point there is like that if you look in America it's tricky how to say this right. I don't know how to say this right way. If you look, if you look in America at Buddhist teachers who were born in America, let's put it that way, because that's different. Like, for example, Gyume Khenpo Rinpoche is in America teaching, but he's extremely precise, or something like that. So, but if you look in America at Buddhist teachers born in America, oftentimes it's like that, where there is not consistently one. If you actually look at the words, like, you could say, oh, this sentence would fit with this tenet system, that sentence would fit with that tenet system. So I think if you actually analyze it, that's what you'll find oftentimes. Not always, but oftentimes, is that it's not always consistent. Whereas, if you study with a well-trained Tibetan teacher, they're quite clear. And I want to raise one more point about, so, that's just about where these, so it'd be interesting, right? Whereas if you were to study, say, with a Theravadan teacher, it'd be, I don't know, I haven't studied with Theravadan, like with, say, a Theravadan teacher, I mean, from from Burma, to kind of say, okay, what's their, what tenet system are they coming from? That'd be a different question, right? Because they're strictly raised within a tradition, whereas you can see from Jack Kornfield's quote, right? Whereas he's a well-educated American person, right, who's been exposed to Hinduism and Taoism and Buddhism and psychology and other, Western philosophies, and so they all kind of appear in some of his language choices. Whereas if you were listening to a Burmese monk, well, they might be educated in those things too, but they're very much within a tradition, so it'd be a little different, I imagine. But then I just want to raise one more point, and then I want to also give time for questions and comments. But I want to raise one more point also, which is about the Tibetan tradition. And I'll say this way, like, actually, I'm prepared. We had agreed that the next series of classes starting in January will be on now FPMT changed the wording, so it's mind and awareness, which includes 2 modules, one on mind and mental functions, and another on awareness and knowers. So it covers both. So we'll do that. And so I was looking at the materials, sort of preparing, and I was thinking, okay, well, I wasn't sure if I was going to just do one of the 2 halves, but we should do the whole thing, because it's all about piece in a way, even though it covers different texts, 2 different texts, but they flow one to the other. But my point is this, so these are topics, we have like FPMT offers translations of Tibetan texts on them and commentaries by Tibetan masters on those topics and so on. And all that material is from a Sautantrika perspective. So, when we study mind, awareness and knowers, and mind and its functions, we're going to study it from the perspective of the Sautantrikas. And that's how the Tibetan monks and nuns study it. And so, my point there is, if you really want, in other words, that I guess my point I'm getting at is this, is that the Tibetans themselves study all 4 tenet systems and practice them. So when they spend, for example, so they'll spend years studying, long periods of time, for example, studying, actual texts by great Indian Buddhist masters. And actually, it's most of the texts they study are not from a Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective. Now, when they're studying Madhyamaka, then they study, Chandrakirti, right, is the main text, which is Prasangika. And they also study Nagarjuna and Buddhapalada, so they study the Prasangikas in that. But when they're studying Abhidharma, they're studying it from a Sautantrika perspective, I believe. When they study Vinaya, it's from a Vaibhashika perspective, and so on. So my point is that the Tibetan, if you talk with a Geshe, for example, from Tibet, or from now India, whatever, they're going to be very learned in all 4 tenet systems because they actually study them all. If that makes sense. Not just, it's like, so when we say, and sometimes I think it's kind of confusing, if I go to these, sometimes I've been asked to attend these events, right? It's like different Buddhist traditions coming together, and they'll say, "Oh, you're a Vajrayana," and I go, "What?" Because of course, Vajrayana is part of the Tibetan tradition, but most of what we study is not Vajrayana, right? If you're studying mind and its functions, you're studying Sautantrika. If you're studying emptiness, it's going to be from a Prasangika perspective. If you're studying ethics, it's going to be from, actually even in the Lamrim, like the section on ethics and on, karma is, really it's from that would be consistent with the Vaibhashika's perspective on that. So even within the Lamrim, if you look at the Lamrim, the section on emptiness is in accordance with Prasangika Madhyamaka. But, the teachings on developing calm abiding are taken from texts that are, some of which are from the mind-only school's perspective, because Tsongkhapa felt that was, that they gave a very clear explanation of that, and some of those texts are from the Sautantrika Madhyamaka perspective on developing calm abiding. So my point is that these traditions, all of these tenet systems are studied in the Tibetan tradition, and also they're studied in various other traditions. But if you get familiar with the tenets, then you can listen to a person and sort of say, what perspective are they coming from? And one thing that I want to, I was really, it's kind of actually, when I think of teaching the next module in the basic program, it's kind of fun to go, okay, this is going to be from the perspective of Sautantrika, not from a Madhyamaka perspective. And there will be some points, most of it, what they will be presented, Madhyamakas would agree with. There will be a few points Madhyamakas would disagree with. And that's useful to know, if that makes sense. But Tibetans would say it's more useful to study that from a Sautantrika perspective, so they teach from that perspective, from a practice perspective, from a practical, from perspective of practice. Let me stop there and see if people have questions. comments or questions about any of the, about either what I've talked about. I mean, I could say more obviously easily, but about either what I've talked about or about these two lower, I'll call them lower tenet systems, because I didn't cover everything that people have asked about. So people may have other questions about these. And Lynn, you have a hand.
I've sort of struggled with why we're learning these different schools, okay? And I think what I've grown to think for myself is that it sort of frees up your thinking. However you land, it sort of helps you, I know this isn't Buddhist, but be more self-conscious or sort of understand more how you're thinking about things as you move forward in your practice. So it's almost like it's hard to get there without having another system set up against the system you're used to or I'm used to.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree.
And I also thought what you were saying about American-born teachers sort of mix up all these traditions, and that makes sense to me because I think the general American culture is very, it's almost like a foil to the Buddhist thing. I mean, it's totally different. And it's sort of like very concrete, non-theoretical, there's all kinds of materialistic. So if you want to reach the most people, I mean, I'm not talking about our class. And it's interesting that there's some foreign-born people in our class because I think they get it easier than people that were born here in the United States. But I think you need a bridge because I don't think most people would get this at all. So those are just my thoughts.
Interesting.
Barahi is laughing.
Well, I could really identify with what you're saying because I just want to make a comment. When I was raised a Catholic in a Jesuit tradition, and I asked my father, why did you raise me Catholic? And he gave a very interesting answer. He said, because I wanted you to have a basis of comparison for later so that you would have that ability to compare and not be totally lost. And it really has been something later in life that I've deeply appreciated because I've seen with a lot of Westerners and especially struggling with Buddhism, when they're not raised in a particular faith, it has been very difficult to, you know what I mean? Now, on the other hand, I also struggle with my own grasping within a tradition. You know what I mean? Like, because it's almost easier. Okay, I'll just say I'm a prasankika because, I can have something to hold on to here. But in fact, that's, not really, appropriate.
That's good. Well, I don't. And actually, was there? I mean, I liked that discussion. I can't remember. Was there a question I missed? Was there something else I was supposed to comment on particularly, or not? Okay, good. I was sort of interested, and then I realized I didn't even catch that. But Sujata, and you want to jump in?
Just really enjoying the discussion. Thank you, everybody. Really, really helpful, and just the parallels are interesting, regardless of what continent you were born on. I think that there's more of this really interesting distinction between having been raised in a very linear, very specific religious tradition versus not, right? And that might be something interesting to think about. But my question is actually about the Sautantrika, the Sautrantikas accepting both self-knowers and external objects. So that comes from one of the charts you gave us at the beginning. Or it's actually the definition, right? That they accept both self-knowers and external objects. And I have a lot of trouble understanding how there isn't a reification of the self when you accept self-knowers. So I think that's my question. It's with regard to what does it mean to accept a self-knower, but still reject the notion of self. I think I'm stuck there.
Oh, that's interesting. which is a very, yeah, I guess I'll just share a few reflections. Like one is, it's kind of interesting. Like from one perspective, of course, like if you take it from, say, Chandrakirti's perspective, then he would say, well, it is a subtle assertion of a kind of self, and therefore is wrong. So that would be the Prasangika's perspective on that. But actually, if you think about it this way, like self-knowers are, first of all, like, I mean, actually, if we kind of, like, I guess I'll say it this way, like, if I step back and actually try to give it from the other perspective, like Dharmakirti, right, the great Buddhist logician and philosopher, asserted self-knowers. And Dignaga asserted self-knowers. So you'd have to go, so then you step back and you go, oh, wait a second, okay, it can't be that. Whereas these were among the greatest, they're the great masters of Nalanda. They weren't flippant or, sort of bad philosophers. They were deep thinkers. And so what did they mean when they said self-knowers, right? And I guess their view, right, which I'm not sure I can represent perfectly, to be honest, but is that a self-knower is not, it's funny, like, a self-knower is not a soul, and it's not a self-sufficient substantiated person or something like that. Really, what they're getting at in self-knower is not some kind of being, and it's not a self, really. But when they talk as self-knowers, what they're talking about is that there's a, in their view, right, what they would say is that there's a natural function, this is my own language now, of mind, which is naturally, so it's not a person, it's not a being, it's not a self, it's like a natural function of mind that's aware it's experiencing something. And they would say, very simply, right, the proof of that is like, actually, I'll give a simplistic example for that, like, or a practical, like I can remember the first time I met you, Sujata, at Vajrapani Institute. Like we chatted, and so like Dharmakirti would say to me, right, well, Lauren, how do you remember? Like you don't, it's like, how is it that you remember meeting Sujata at Vajrapani Institute? And you remember sort of, you don't just remember her face, you remember, being yourself, meeting her. That it was like you were Lauren and she was Sujata, and you were in the Gompa and you said hello to each other, and chatted. And so Dharmakirti would say, the fact that you can remember that is proof that that you were aware of experiencing. That's part of your mind, not you. Actually, that's probably an imprecise use of language. That part of your mind was aware of experiencing it because you can remember it. And if there weren't a part of your mind that was aware of experiencing that moment, then you wouldn't be able to remember that it happened. And that you were present at that time, and so on, and had that experience. So they would say memory is the proof that there is a kind of part of awareness that naturally is aware of experience. And they would say that's not a self, that's not a person, that's not a being. It's a kind of natural function of how the mind works, in a way, in each moment. And that it's not like that mind isn't thinking about the experience, doesn't own the experience, isn't some kind of being that registers the experience. It's just a kind of natural function of mind that's sort of that's naturally aware of experience, in a way. So that's when they say self-knower, they don't mean like knowing a self. What they mean is that there's a function of awareness that's aware of. So they mean like self, like not self in the sense of a person, but self-knower in the sense that it's aware of, that awareness is aware of itself experiencing in that sense. And the proof is that it can remember that. I think that's the way, that's my best understanding of how they sort of explain that. So they're not asserting a kind of being or a self or But does that, I don't know if that answers it much.
It does. It's starting to feel a little bit like just objectifying it in the same way that you would the directionally partless particles or the 120th of the finger snap, like
Yep.
that it's just this thing that's happening.
Yeah.
And if you see it more that way, just functioning of a thing. So if you're going to accept material things, then why couldn't you accept this knowing thing too, that just is happening out there?
That's it.
So that helps. But ultimately, it's adding another layer of things that could be reified from a prasangika madhyamaka perspective.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly, and whether it's, you can see why Chandrakirti, like he takes to task, if with the mind only followers, he takes them to task about having the alaya. With these folks, he takes them to task, with Dignaga, he takes them to task about having a self-knower. Anything that's a kind of that's a potential reification, he says though that's a reification, and he sort of is very incisive about those points. But yeah, from these people's perspective, it's exactly what you said. It's just another functioning thing. It's not some self, it's not some being, it's just another functioning part of how, atoms work this way and mind works that way. And yeah, you get it.
Right. So I guess with the Vaibhashikas, there's just the atoms, and with the Sautrantikas, it's both of these things. And with mind only, it's just the mind piece of it. And with Prasangikas, there's nothing.
Nothing to grasp.
Okay. Very helpful. Thank you.
And Ryan, you had your hand up. I don't know if there was something.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the concept of like a self-knower as like a function. What about, I was just thinking about what about times when you don't remember things, like when let's say you took an Ambien to go to sleep, and then you found out you were sleepwalking all night and you did all these things, but you had absolutely no memory of it. Where did that self-knower go? He's not there. Where did he go? That's the first thing I thought of when I'm talking about this, like recorder of events. Like it can go away and you can still do things. So where does it go? That was my thought.
Yeah, and that's interesting because there's when we get actually in the module on awareness and knowers, they talk about there's like one type of awareness is awareness to which an object appears but is not apprehended, and that would be that. So there's a kind of consciousness present, but doesn't really apprehend its object, so it can't remember it. That's part of the definition of that kind of consciousness. But one question that I don't know the answer to would be, where is the self when there? So Buddhist epistemology sort of acknowledges there are these kinds of awareness to which objects appear but are not apprehended, and what they mean by not apprehended is that you can't remember it. It doesn't really apprehend the object, and therefore it doesn't get what's the word? It doesn't get, you can't remember it, for example, and so on. But you're raising an interesting point, which is from a Tantrika perspective, what is the where's the self-knower at that when there's that mode? And I don't know the answer to that, actually.
Yeah, I guess they never drank too much or something. Where
I don't know.
No, I don't know.
But yeah, when there's no Ambien at that time, so.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, obviously they had that kind. I guess that's an interesting question. Would it be one question? I don't know the answer. One question I would sort of contemplate is like, that's interesting. Like sometimes you have this sense of like, I'm thinking of like times when I've had the experience of having a awareness to which a object appears but not apprehended, where there is still a kind of sense of like, sometimes like if somebody sleptwalk, they could go, oh, I don't remember what happened, or somebody's drunk. I've had many times people talk to me about, at work, it's like, oh, people go, I don't remember what happened, but I had a weird night, or something like that. Like, so there's some sense of the objects were not apprehended, but there's some sense still from this school's perspective, they would say, well, maybe they would say that, maybe my guess is that they might say, well, there's still the self-knower that's aware that you were in a weird state or something, that I was in some weird state and I kind of feel weird about it. And that's still a kind of self-knowing, but you can't remember the objects. But I'm not sure how they would. To be honest, I don't know how this school would talk about self-knowers in that context. I've never heard that taught on. Yeah. Because this school would say there's always a kind of self-knower, but if the object's not apprehended, it's not going to remember the object. Anyway, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure how they would say that. Yeah, other thoughts or ideas or questions about these two tenet systems? Oh, Frank, sorry. Oh, I didn't see your hand up. Frank.
Oh, hi.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
Yeah, question. So the meditative techniques that the Vaibhashika Sutrantika would use for realizing selflessness, how do they differ from, let's say, the Prasangika meditation on selflessness? Is there a big difference?
Great question. Yes, yeah, there are real differences. Like one is, well, one I already kind of mentioned briefly is that they identify kind of a different object of negation in a way, right? They're not, their object of negation that they're sort of meditating on the lack of existence of is less subtle. That's one point. But that's not how they would think of it, actually, is it? That would be how a Prasangika would view it. But I guess I'll say a few thoughts. Like, if you think about it, like for a Prasangika, right, or Madhyamaka person when they're meditating, right, there's this very clear process of, so you say it right, of using logic, right, to analyze. So you sort of, like when you look at Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Bodhipalita, Aryadeva, it's all very clear, Shantideva, all that, right? Like, it's very clear, right? So you identify your sense of self that you're grasping at, and then you use all these kinds of, right, there's like the fourfold reasoning, there's this sevenfold reasoning, there are all these like reasonings that you use. And the idea, right, is in those schools is that you, as I mentioned earlier, that you come to a kind of non-affirming negation, right, where you come to this point of recognize, just where your mind is just absorbed in the lack of existence of the object of negation. Whereas in these schools, and this is where, like, I think some of those quotes I read are interesting to think about, right? Because they're getting at, in some of, it's not that, certainly the Sautantrikas do use logic, because, for example, there are texts by Dharmakirti that are Sautantrika and they're using logic, but a few things. One is like, trying to say this the right way, like, one point is that in these schools, like when you look at the 5 aggregates, as they were mentioned in the text, right? Like, so you might, like, in these schools, you might observe, like, so if you think about mindfulness practice, right? According to like the 4 foundations of mindfulness, right? And the 37, what they call them, the 37 factors of enlightenment and so on. In these schools, they practice those, the Mahayanas practice that also, but in these schools, they practice that exclusively. So if you think about it in this way, like these schools, they would be looking at they would be looking at the 5 aggregates first in the nature of suffering, right? Like, so they would look at the 5, like, because actually I do want to, maybe this is good to say, actually. This is a kind of an interesting point. I often think this, in America, sometimes when you say practice mindfulness, right? What they often mean is like, notice your breath, or they mean notice your breath and other sensations. And that's what I would call secular mindfulness, and which actually Tibetans would say is a good warm-up for actual Buddhist practice. Tibetans would say that's a very good warm-up to do Buddhist practice, to calm your extra conceptuality in order to then start your meditation, right? But in sort of the secular sense in America, it's just focusing on your sensations, right? But going to your point, like, in the real Buddhist context, right, and actually I saw it online in a few, like sometime in the next couple of weeks, as long as the Dalai Lama is going to give a commentary requested by Theravadan monks for the great sutra on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, right, which is on this topic. And if you look, and the great sutra of the 4 foundations of mindfulness is a Theravadan, I think it exists in Tibet, and I'm not sure, but it certainly exists in the Pali Canon, where it's been translated into English from, and if you look in there, right, so, and the 4 foundations of mindfulness are among the 37 factors of enlightenment and so on. But anyway, so if you look in there, right, when you're looking, so if you're practicing in these traditions, right, you would be looking at your experience of the 5 aggregates in the moment. And first you would recognize they're in the nature of suffering, right? You would contemplate how they're, and you would actually, you would contemplate, but also observe, right, how they're in the nature of suffering. You would contemplate and observe how they're impermanent, and all 5 aggregates are impermanent, right? And when it came time to selflessness, right, you would observe how the 5 aggregates are empty of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? So you would be actually observing the 5 aggregates and noting how, so you would be noting that there's no self within them. There's no owner of them, like as we were getting at, right? There's no self that controls them. But what's different, one thing that's very different, so one is you would be doing that in that way, right? By observing the 5 aggregates through a practice of, in this case, of mindfulness of the 5 aggregates, and being mindful of the lack of a self that's an owner or that exists within them, or that owns them, or that controls them. But actually, one difference is that you wouldn't be negating, think of like, you wouldn't negate the 5 aggregates themselves, actually, in that context, right? So if you think of the Heart Sutra, right, the Heart Sutra says the 5 aggregates also are empty of inherent existence, right? That's Mahayana tenets. Whereas in this tenet system, you wouldn't necessarily refute the 5 aggregates. You would just note, wow, my experience of the 5 aggregates is their nature of suffering. My experience of the 5 aggregates is they're in the nature of impermanence, for example. And there would come a point where you would recognize they're without a self, right? And in this context, you would say, when they say empty, it means that that doesn't mean they're empty of, actually, because there is a term empty in the Theravadan tradition, the Pali, but it doesn't mean empty. It doesn't mean the 5 aggregates are empty of inherent nature the way it does in the Heart Sutra. What it means is they're empty of having an owner, right? Or they're empty of having somebody who owns them. They're empty of being the possessions of some being, right? Which is this lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? And so you can see the difference in the method, right? And again, what I want to emphasize is bodhisattvas also practice that method, right? But they don't view that method as sufficient, right? So they also practice that method of the 4. They would practice mindfulness in that way as well, but they would say that's not sufficient. There's still a grasping at the aggregates as a self, and as Nagarjuna says, therefore, from Nagarjuna's perspective, therefore a grasping at a self will re-arise, even if you temporarily suppress it through being aware that there's no self within the aggregates, that the aggregates are not owned by a self. You're still grasping the aggregates, so a self will re-arise. But in these, so that's the difference. So he would say you have to identify that subtle object and refute it through logic. Whereas in this method, in one example I'm giving, there are various methods, right? You could just observe the 5 aggregates, right, as a process that's impermanent, that's in the nature of suffering, that's without a self, and that they're not owned by a self. And therefore, when you realize that there's no self within them, and they're not possessed by a self or controlled by a self, you would be freeing yourself from the self-sufficient, substantially existent self, which is the goal in this school, right? And then by realizing that lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, you would achieve liberation according to these schools. So it's it's a little bit of a different method, isn't it? Then? Does that make sense, kind of?
Fantastic, thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And that it's interesting too to think about that bodhisattvas have to practice all of those, right? So they have to, bodhisattvas, it's not that you don't practice those practices, you do practice them, but they're not sufficient, right? You have to ultimately practice, the 4-fold or the 7-fold reasoning to refute the subtle self. But these practices would help you do that, if that makes sense, right? Because then you'd be able to identify, wow, even after and this goes back to Lynn's question too, I just want to point out, like about why study these, right? Because if you can actually refute the self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? And then if you can say, what am I still grasping, right? Then you know the subtle object, right? Whereas otherwise, it's very hard to tell. Like when I said earlier, like, oh, think about when you're anxious, right? If you're we all can get anxious about something or other, right? So you think, oh, when I'm anxious, then what's that self, right? But as I said earlier, I think that would be the self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So that's not the subtle one, that arises based on the subtle one, but it's not the subtle. So it's very hard. That's one point. And it's very hard to also get at what's the subtlest level of self-grasping. But if you can refute the grosser selves, like, as if you think about it from a processing ego perspective, there's the grossest is the independent, unitary, unitary permanent self, right? That's easy, right? Then you get to the self-sufficient existent. That's hard. Then how do you get to the inherently existent self? That's very difficult to identify. But it becomes much easier if you've identified the first one, if you've identified the second, and then you say, what am I still grasping? Right? What's there that I still grasp as a self? It becomes much more useful then. So these are also useful in that way for meditation practice. And to get it, like when you study something like the 4 foundations of mindfulness, right? How do you practice them? It helps if you've studied these tenet systems, right? To know what are you actually sort of looking at, and how do you meditate in those ways? Because bodhisattvas do all those practices. That's part of the point. Yeah, other comments? We just have a couple more minutes. Any other comments or questions before? I'll say a couple things about next class in a minute. Okay, maybe we'll stop there then with the cover. So maybe I'll say, so with my plan then, which again, it's on the website, but I think the next class is, what is it? Oh, it's next week. Yeah. Yeah, so the final class will be next week, and that's again this so, and what I'm thinking to do next week on the final class will be to do the same thing we did today in the sense of focusing, but looking at the 2 Mahayana tenet systems in particular, so the mind only and the prasangikas, and sort of just explore those. If you have questions, bring them. If you have questions you want to be sure I address, you can feel free to email me them or just bring them up in class, either way. And then we'll talk about those tenet systems. And then I want to apologize. I've been slow. I got the completion certificates, but I just haven't. I downloaded them all, but I didn't get a chance to actually email them, which I intended to do before today. So I'll email those out as soon as I can. So I do have them on my computer. I just haven't emailed them to everybody individually. And then that's one thing. And the others, and like I said, so I finally, I was in touch with FPMT a little bit because I was trying to clarify in terms of, just so you know, the next series, like I was saying, I definitely want to start for those who are interested in January. But I am going to combine, I think the way they do it now is kind of good, actually. It's the same material, but they've kind of arranged it slightly differently. So what they call is mind and awareness, which includes awareness and knowers and mind and its functions. So it's sort of a whole class. So I'm just going to do both. I'll just sort of do it as the way they do it. It used to be 2 separate modules in a way, and now they've combined it into kind of one slightly bigger module. It's still not terribly big, so it's not huge. But so anyway, I'm going to soon email Gabe and sort of have that up on the website. I was sort of trying to clarify the new materials, and I'm going to get them down. I downloaded them, so now I can once we send that out. I guess my point is I'll send that to Gabe soon. FPMT nowadays asks that we not just post the materials to the website, so I will have Gabe post the course to the website, and then as people are interested, if you're going to want to take that module, then you can, I guess, email me and I'll just email you the materials. That's the way FPMT likes us to do it. So that way everybody can have the materials, but just if we post them generally, I guess then like people who are not connected to the center and FPMT can just download them, and it sort of goes out on the web in a way that they don't want. So, but everybody who's in the class, it's free. I mean, the materials are free, you can have them, and so I'll email them to people as you want when we start that. But I'll sort of organize that soon. I've been organizing, but I'll have it up soon on the website. Lydia, yeah.
When would that start in January? If you know.
I didn't actually. Yeah, I was thinking about that recently, and that's gonna for sure. That's gonna. I mean, that'll be online. So we'll do it this way, and I guess probably I don't see any reason why not. So maybe like the 8th, either the 8th or the 15th. Oh no, not the the 8th or the 15th. One of those two. Do people have a preference? I don't know.
Me later.
What's that? Later. So
it's just a bad time of year. It's okay. Busy,
so maybe
I'll go with the flow, whatever people want.
Is the 15th good for most people? Should we do that? Okay. Maybe we'll start on the 15th. Yeah, like it's nice to have a little bit of a break also maybe. So I'll make a note of that. Okay, yeah. So maybe I'll do the first class on the 15th. Yeah, that's good. Oh, and John, yeah.
Yeah. And then same time.
Yeah, it'll be the same time slot and all that. Yeah.
And do you want each one of us to send you an email that says, please send us the documents? Or will you, for those of us who attended most of the sessions, will you just send it to all of us then? Or how do you want to do that?
Oh, what do y'all prefer? It doesn't matter to me. What do y'all prefer? Is it better to just send it?
I think it's easier if we don't, otherwise you're going to get at least 10 or 11, at a minimum, you're going to get 10 emails from this group.
That's a good idea. So maybe what I should do, tell me if this is good. Because I don't care if people have it, to be honest. Like, is everyone who gets a completion certificate, I'll send it to. And then if you didn't do this one for a completion certificate, then email me and I'll send it to you. So if you're getting a completion certificate for this program, and even if you don't, even if you end up not taking that, I don't care if you have it. So what's the difference? You know, it's like you took this and you're a student of the center. So I'm going to do that. When I send the completion certificates, I'll send those materials and with it. And so but so if somebody wants them and isn't getting a completion certificate, then just remind me and I'll send it to you also. Because that way I don't, because that'll be an easy way to do it. Since I'm sending emails anyway, I can just include those. And what I'm thinking to do also is I'll just mention this. I think what I'll do is there are two different root texts. There's a root text on awareness and knowers, and there's a root text on mind and its functions. I'm going to teach them first awareness and knowers, then mind and its functions. But I think I'll just send them both, just so people have it all, and you can look at it, and you can read it, whatever you want that way. And so I'm going to send those and some charts. There are like charts that they have. There's some nice materials FPMT has. So maybe I'll just send it all at once rather than having to keep sending emails. So I'll just send. So you'll get more materials than sort of you need to start with, but that way you have it and you can download it and use it as you want. Does that sound okay to everybody? Okay, cool. So I'll do that. And I'll try to get to that fairly soon.
One quick question, just because of my role in the center. If somebody who's not in this group now then registers later for it, do you want them to email you, or do you want them to be able to upload it as they come on to the course? You know how sometimes people kind of.
Yeah, if you're willing to send this, if somebody wants to register and join the class, I'm going to send them to you anyway. So if you're okay sharing it, that'd be great. So
okay, all righty.
So yeah, and you can share. I guess two things, right? So one is if somebody emails you and wants to join that class, it's totally fine with me. I think it's good if you just send it to them. And also, if once you have it on your computer, if there's somebody, occasionally that happened where somebody joins a class suddenly and wants to look at the particular text, you can share it in the chat. There's no problem. FPMT is not going to have an issue with that. I'm not going to. That's good. So if you want to email it to somebody or share it in the chat, that's fine. Yeah, all they don't want is like sort of to be out on the web, sort of on the website.
Sort of out of there, yeah.
All right, well, great. We should do the dedication. Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Through these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, may the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.